The night was cold, the kind that sank into your bones and refused to leave. The wind howled through the trees of Pine Hollow, a sleepy town on the edge of a vast, uncharted forest. Henry Turner, a retired park ranger, pulled his coat tighter around himself as he trudged toward his cabin. He had spent most of his life in the wilderness, understanding its whispers and respecting its dangers, but nothing prepared him for what he found that night. A pair of glowing eyes watched him from the darkness. At first, Henry thought it was a stray dog. It stood just beyond the reach of his porch light, its form shadowy, yet unmistakably large. "Hey there, buddy," he called, crouching slightly. He had a way with animals, always had. The creature didn't move. It simply stared. Something about its stance made Henry uneasy. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like a primal instinct telling him this wasn't just a dog. Then, as if deciding it had seen enough, the creature turned and disappeared into the woods. Henry stayed still, listening to the silence left in its wake. The wind rustled the pines, but beyond that, nothing. Still, that night, as he sat by the fire sipping his tea, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The next morning, Henry found paw prints leading up to his porch, massive ones. He knelt down, tracing the impressions with his fingers. These weren't from a dog. They were too big, too deep. A wolf, maybe? But there hadn't been wolves around Pine Hollow in years. Henry spent the day chopping firewood and fixing up his cabin, but the thought of those tracks stayed with him. He had encountered wild animals all his life, but something about this one felt different. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Henry heard it, a low guttural growl. He turned slowly. There, at the tree line, stood the creature again. It was closer now, its thick fur rippling in the dying light. Golden eyes locked onto Henry's, and for a brief moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then it did something strange. It bared its teeth, not in a snarl, but in a silent warning. And then it was gone. Henry stood there for a long while, heart pounding. Something was out there. And it wasn't just another animal. Something was watching. Something was waiting. Henry didn't sleep that night. The creature had warned him, not with a snarl, not with aggression, but with something deeper, an instinct that told him danger was near. At dawn, he grabbed his old rifle, not to use it, but for peace of mind. He wasn't a hunter, never had been, but he wasn't about to be caught off guard. That's when he saw the tracks again. This time, they weren't alone. A second set of prints followed the first, larger, heavier. They led deep into the forest, disappearing among the underbrush. Henry's gut twisted. Something bigger was out there. And then he heard it, a howl. Not just any howl. This wasn't the call of an ordinary wolf. This sound carried through the trees, echoing over the hills like a ghostly wail. It was deep, raw, almost mournful. Something about it made Henry's skin crawl. Then, as if answering the first, another howl rose in the distance. This one was different, more guttural, more sinister. Henry gripped his rifle. He had lived in these woods for years. He had never heard anything like this before, and neither had the town, because by noon, Pine Hollow was buzzing with fear. By the time Henry made it into town, people were talking. "Did you hear that last night?" a man at the gas station muttered. "Woke my whole family up," said another. "That wasn't no normal wolf." Henry listened. He didn't like what he was hearing. Then he heard something that stopped him cold. An old man, George, who had lived in Pine Hollow even longer than Henry, leaned in close. This happened before. he whispered. Henry frowned. "What are you talking about?" George's eyes were clouded with something, fear, maybe regret. "A long time ago, a man took in a stray, a dog," he thought. Turned out it wasn't a dog at all. Henry's pulse quickened. "Then what was it?" George hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "It was a warning." Henry's stomach dropped. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't alone. Henry didn't waste any time. He knew the forest like the back of his hand, but something about those howls sent a chill through him. They weren't natural, not in the way a wolf's call should be. They carried something else, something deeper, a warning, a message. Ignoring the uneasy stares of the townspeople, Henry returned home before nightfall. He reinforced his doors, made sure his rifle was loaded, and kept a lantern lit. He had faced mountain lions, bears, even desperate poachers in his time, but nothing had ever made him feel this unsettled. Then, just past midnight, it came again. A howl, longer this time, drawn out like a desperate cry. Henry sat up in bed, heart hammering. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Then he saw them, eyes glowing in the darkness. But not just one pair, several. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, forcing himself to stay calm. The creatures didn't move, just stared. He had seen plenty of wolves in his time, but these weren't ordinary wolves. They were too big, their forms unnaturally still, watching him with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. Then suddenly the door creaked open. Henry spun, rifle aimed, but there was no one there, just the wind pushing the door slightly ajar. He cursed under his breath. He was sure he had locked it. His hand reached out to shut it, but before he could, something moved outside, a shadow, and then a figure stepped forward. It was the creature he had seen before, the massive stray with golden eyes. But this time, Henry saw it more clearly. It wasn't just a dog. It wasn't just a wolf. It was something in between. And it wasn't alone. A second creature emerged from the trees, even larger, its eyes burning like embers. The two beasts stood side by side, watching him. Henry's grip on the rifle tightened. Then the first one, the one he had seen before, lowered its head and let out a deep, guttural growl. Not at Henry, at something behind him. Henry barely had time to react before a low, menacing snarl echoed from inside the cabin. Something had already gotten in. Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel it, the presence behind him. The way the air in the cabin suddenly felt heavier, colder. He didn't turn around immediately. Every instinct, every ounce of survival experience told him that whatever was inside was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The two creatures outside, the massive wolf-like beings, remained in place, their golden eyes locked onto something just past Henry's shoulder. They weren't threatening him. They were warning him. Slowly, he turned. The lantern on the table flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. And in that dim light, he saw it, a shape, hunched in the farthest corner of the room. Its body was massive, its fur dark and matted, but its eyes weren't like the others. They were pitch black, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. It exuded something primal, something unnatural. It wasn't just an animal. It was something wrong. The thing let out a low, ragged breath, its chest rising and falling unevenly, like it was struggling to contain something within itself. Then, in a single, slow motion, it lifted its head, revealing a maw of jagged, uneven teeth. Henry didn't wait to find out what it planned to do next. He moved fast, bringing his rifle up. But before he could fire, the thing lunged. A blur of black fur and claws tore toward him faster than anything that size should be able to move. Henry barely managed to throw himself to the side as the beast crashed into the wooden table, splintering it in two. Then, from outside, the first wolf let out a bone-chilling snarl. The two creatures at the door moved instantly, barreling through the entrance in a blur of motion. They didn't attack Henry. They attacked the thing. The cabin exploded into chaos, growls, snarls, the sound of claws ripping into wood and flesh. The black-eyed creature let out a shriek, a sound so unnatural it sent a sharp pain through Henry's skull. But the golden-eyed wolves weren't letting it go. One of them, the one Henry had seen first, the one that had been watching him for days, sank its massive jaws into the creature's throat. The other clamped onto its side, dragging it down. The struggle lasted mere seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, the black-eyed beast stopped moving. Silence. Henry remained frozen, his rifle still clenched in his shaking hands. The golden-eyed wolves stood over the unmoving form, their breathing heavy, their fur streaked with something dark. Then slowly, one of them, the first one, the one that had been warning him all along, turned its gaze toward Henry, not with hostility, not with threat, but with something almost human. And then it spoke, a deep, rumbling voice, not a growl, not a snarl, but words. "You should not have let it in." Henry's blood ran cold, his grip on the rifle faltered, his mind screamed that he must have imagined it, that no wolf, no creature should be capable of speech. But before he could say anything, the two wolves, if that's what they even were, turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the mangled remains of whatever had been inside his cabin. And Henry, standing there, breathless, realizing one terrifying truth. That thing hadn't just found its way inside. It had been invited in. Henry stood in the wreckage of his cabin, heart still hammering against his ribs. The golden-eyed wolves had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the mutilated remains of the black-eyed creature. The lantern flickered weakly, its light casting jagged shadows across the blood-streaked floor. His breathing was uneven. His hands trembled. What had he just witnessed? Slowly, Henry forced himself to move, stepping over the shattered table. He knelt beside the body of the thing that had attacked him. Up close, it was even more grotesque. Its fur thick and tangled, its limbs unnaturally long, ending in clawed fingers that looked almost human. He swallowed hard. This wasn't a normal wolf. This wasn't even an animal. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his stomach turn. The creature's fur was shifting, rippling like waves in water. Slowly, horribly, the snout began to shrink, the fangs receding, the long, twisted limbs snapping back into unnatural proportions. And then, right before Henry's eyes, the thing changed. Its form withered, its monstrous shape shrinking until, lying before him, was a man, or what was left of one. The body was gaunt, skin stretched too thin over bones that seemed wrong, like they had been forced into a shape they weren't meant to be in. His fingers were still elongated, his nails jagged and thick like claws, but his face was unmistakably human. Henry stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. This was a man. This thing, this monster, had once been human. A sharp wind whistled through the trees outside, rattling the broken door against its hinges. Henry forced himself to breathe, to think. This wasn't just some animal attack. This was something far worse. And those wolves, the golden-eyed ones, they had known. They had been trying to warn him, trying to protect him. He had to find them. He had to find answers. Without wasting another second, Henry grabbed his coat, his rifle, and the lantern. The night was still deep, the forest thick with shadows, but there was no turning back now. He stepped outside, following the tracks left by the golden-eyed wolves. And as he disappeared into the woods, a single thought gnawed at the back of his mind. How many more of these things were out there? The forest swallowed Henry whole. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something metallic. The trail of the golden-eyed wolves was easy to follow. Their massive paw prints pressed deep into the damp earth, leading him away from his ruined cabin and deeper into the wilderness. The further he walked, the heavier the air became. It wasn't just the cold, it was something unseen, something pressing against his chest like an invisible hand. A warning. But Henry had come too far to turn back now. After nearly an hour of silent pursuit, he saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in silver moonlight. At the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisting out of the earth like grasping fingers. And beneath it, they were waiting. The two golden-eyed wolves stood side by side, their forms still and watchful. But they weren't alone. Behind them, partially hidden by the shadows of the great tree, stood a woman. She was tall, her presence commanding, yet eerily calm. Her dark hair tumbled over her shoulders, and her piercing amber eyes locked onto Henry the moment he stepped forward. But there was something strange about her, something not quite human. Henry's grip on his rifle tightened. "You knew," he said, his voice hoarse. "You knew what that thing was." The woman didn't answer right away. She stepped forward, and Henry noticed the two wolves didn't just allow it. They moved with her as though they were part of her. Finally, she spoke. "It was not the first," she said softly, "and it will not be the last." A cold shiver ran down Henry's spine. What the hell is happening? The woman tilted her head, studying him like he was the strange one here. "You have lived on the edge of this forest for years, yet you have never questioned why the wolves disappeared, why your town fell silent at night, why the trees whisper warnings that no one listens to." Henry clenched his jaw. "You're saying there are more of those things?" The woman stepped closer, and Henry realized something strange. Her breath didn't fog in the cold air. "They are called the Hallowed," she said. "Men who gave themselves to the darkness, who lost their humanity piece by piece until there was nothing left but hunger." Henry swallowed hard. "So they're werewolves?" The woman let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Number werewolves are still men, bound by the curse of the moon. The Hallowed are worse. They are not cursed. They are consumed. Henry's hands felt clammy. His mind reeled with the truth that was unfolding before him. "And you?" he asked, voice low. "What are you?" The wolves beside her tensed, but the woman remained still. Then she did something that made Henry's blood run cold. She smiled, and in the moonlight, Henry saw the sharp points of her teeth. Not monstrous, not grotesque, but not human either. "I am the reason Pine Hollow is still standing," she said, "and if you want to live, you'll listen very carefully." The wind picked up, rustling the branches above. In the distance, far beyond the clearing, Henry heard it. Another howl, low, guttural, hungry. The hollowed were not gone, and they were hunting. Henry felt the weight of her words settle deep in his bones. The hollowed, creatures that were once men, now twisted into something monstrous. He had spent his entire life in these woods, believing he understood the wild. But this was something else, something ancient, something terrifying. The woman watched him, her golden eyes unreadable. The two wolves beside her stood like sentinels, their ears perked, their massive forms still. Henry tightened his grip on his rifle. If these things are out there, why hasn't anyone in Pine Hollow seen them? The woman's expression darkened. Because they know how to hide. They are patient. They do not hunt for sport, nor do they kill without reason. She took a step closer. They are waiting. A cold knot formed in Henry's gut. Waiting for what? She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her chin, inhaling sharply. Then she turned her head toward the distant tree line. The howls had grown louder. Henry heard it now, not just one, but several, echoing through the trees, drawing closer. The woman's wolves tensed. Their fur bristled, their golden eyes burning like embers in the dark. They know you killed one of them, the woman murmured. They will come for you. Henry felt his pulse quicken. Then let them come. The woman's lips curled into something between amusement and sorrow. You are brave, but you do not understand. She turned away, walking toward the massive tree. Henry watched as she placed a hand against its rough bark. The wind shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. These creatures, they were once men, she said softly. But the hollowed are not just killers. They are something worse. Henry clenched his jaw. Then tell me, what do they want? The woman exhaled slowly. Then she turned back to him, her golden eyes catching the moonlight. They want to spread. Henry's breath caught. She continued, voice steady but heavy with warning. They do not hunt like wolves. They do not kill for food. They are empty, hollow, driven by only one purpose. Henry swallowed hard. To turn others. The woman nodded. They don't just consume their prey, Henry. They infect it. A sharp chill ran down his spine. He thought of the black-eyed creature in his cabin, the way its body had twisted, shifted, how human it had looked only after it died. How does it happen? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated. A bite, a wound, even a whisper in the wrong ear can be enough. Henry stiffened. He thought back to the struggle in his cabin, the moment he had barely escaped the creature's claws. He reached for his arm, his fingers brushing against the fabric of his jacket. A tear. His stomach dropped. His sleeve had been ripped. He hadn't felt anything at the time, but had it touched him? Had it broken the skin? His hands began to... Henry's mind raced. The woman, this strange, golden-eyed being, stood before him, waiting for his answer. Behind her, the wolves remained still, their ears twitching at the sound of the howls that grew ever closer. The hollowed were coming. He thought of Pine Hollow, of the quiet town that had no idea what was lurking just beyond the trees. He thought of the people who had heard the howls last night, of the ones who dismissed it as nothing more than the return of old predators. They had no idea what was about to descend upon them, but then his hand drifted back to his arm, to the torn fabric of his sleeve. He hadn't checked yet, hadn't dared to. If he was bitten, if even a single wound had broken his skin, he knew what that meant. He clenched his jaw. If I go back, can I stop this? The woman's expression was unreadable. You can try. That's not an answer. She exhaled through her nose, tilting her head slightly. No, Henry, you cannot stop this. His heart pounded. Then what the hell do you expect me to do? Leave my home? Let the town burn? A flicker of something, sadness, understanding, passed through her golden eyes. Pine Hollow has been living on borrowed time. Henry's breath caught. You think this is the first time, she continued. It isn't. This town is built on blood, on secrets long buried. You only see what you were meant to see. She gestured around them, at the great tree, at the darkened forest. There are things older than men in these woods, Henry. There are rules, and Pine Hollow has broken them for far too long. Henry's fingers tightened around his rifle. Then why are you telling me this? If it's already doomed, why even give me a choice? For the first time, the woman hesitated. Then quietly she said, Because you are not like the others. Something about the way she said it made his stomach twist. She glanced down at his arm, at the torn sleeve. His blood ran cold. She knew. Henry inhaled sharply. How long? A few days, she admitted. Maybe less. The reality slammed into him like a fist. He was turning. The Hollowed hadn't come to Pine Hollow just to feed. They had come to recruit. His body felt numb. His mind screamed for him to deny it, to fight it, to say it wasn't possible. But deep down, he knew. He could feel it now, creeping beneath his skin, a quiet, hollow hunger that hadn't been there before. The wolves beside the woman bristled, but did not snarl. They had seen this before. Henry had spent his entire life in these woods. He had never feared them. He had never feared the dark. But now, standing there, staring into the golden eyes of the only creatures that seemed to understand, he realized the truth. He had never been afraid because he had never been alone. The woods had been watching, and now they had claimed him. His grip on the rifle loosened. What happens if I go with you? The woman studied him. You survive. A simple answer, but one filled with weight. Henry turned back toward the distant town, his home, the people he had spent his life protecting, watching over, drinking coffee with at the diner, fixing fences for in the summer. They had no idea what was about to come for them, and he had no idea if he could stop it. He took one last deep breath of the cold night air, closed his eyes, and made his decision. Then he turned and followed the golden-eyed wolves into the woods. And he did not look back. Henry's mind raced. The woman, this strange golden-eyed being, stood before him, waiting for his answer. Behind her, the wolves remained still, their ears twitching at the sound of the howls that grew ever closer. The Hollowed were coming. He thought of Pine Hollow, of the quiet town that had no idea what was lurking just beyond the trees. He thought of the people who had heard the howls last night, of the ones who dismissed it as nothing more than the return of old predators. They had no idea what was about to descend upon them, but then his hand drifted back to his arm, to the torn fabric of his sleeve. He hadn't checked yet, hadn't dared to. If he was bitten, if even a single wound had broken his skin, he knew what that meant. He clenched his jaw. If I go back, can I stop this? The woman's expression was unreadable. You can try. That's not an answer. She exhaled through her nose, tilting her head slightly. No, Henry, you cannot stop this. His heart pounded. Then what the hell do you expect me to do? Leave my home? Let the town burn? A flicker of something, sadness, understanding, passed through her golden eyes. Pine Hollow has been living on borrowed time. Henry's breath caught. You think this is the first time, she continued. It isn't. This town is built on blood, on secrets long buried. You only see what you were meant to see." She gestured around them, at the great tree, at the darkened forest. "There are things older than men in these woods, Henry. There are rules, and Pine Hollow has broken them for far too long." Henry's fingers tightened around his rifle. "Then why are you telling me this? If it's already doomed, why even give me a choice?" For the first time, the woman hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, "Because you are not like the others." Something about the way she said it made his stomach twist. She glanced down at his arm, at the torn sleeve. His blood ran cold. She knew. Henry inhaled sharply. "How long?" "A few days," she admitted. "Maybe less." The reality slammed into him like a fist. He was turning. The Hollowed hadn't come to Pine Hollow just to feed. They had come to recruit. His body felt numb. His mind screamed for him to deny it, to fight it, to say it wasn't possible. But deep down, he knew. He could feel it now, creeping beneath his skin, a quiet, hollow hunger that hadn't been there before. The wolves beside the woman bristled, but did not snarl. They had seen this before. Henry had spent his entire life in these woods. He had never feared them. He had never feared the dark. But now, standing there, staring into the golden eyes of the only creatures that seemed to understand, he realized the truth. He had never been afraid because he had never been alone. The woods had been watching, and now they had claimed him. His grip on the rifle loosened. "What happens if I go with you?" The woman studied him. "You survive." A simple answer, but one filled with weight. Henry turned back toward the distant town, his home, the people he had spent his life protecting, watching over, drinking coffee with at the diner, fixing fences for in the summer. They had no idea what was about to come for them, and he had no idea if he could stop it. He took one last deep breath of the cold night air, closed his eyes, and made his decision. Then he turned and followed the golden-eyed wolves into the woods. And he did not look back.